Welcome to Crosspoint. An interactive program featuring ministers and leaders of the Christian community addressing the issues that are challenging the church today. Here's your host, Mark Taylor.
Wars are no longer just a rumor. Have we now, as this generation, moved forward, stepping into the great final conflicts of the Middle East that the Bible speaks of? Welcome to Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor. My guest is Colonel Robert Maginnis, an expert on the Middle East and how it applies as a Christian with Israel. With us today here we have Robert Maginnis, a retired colonel from the military, and we've talked to Colonel Maginnis before, different times here on Crosspoint, but with the things happening in the Middle East, and I know, Colonel, you've been somewhat, watching everything that's been going on. You've got personal experience from that area and with military and everything. And also, basically, as a Christian, how do we view what is going on in our world? This, I guess it kind of took everybody by surprise, didn't it, except for Hamas?
Well, clearly Hamas had been planning this for years, Mark. To break down the barriers that separate Gaza from southern Israel was something that took considerable planning and thought. They also had sufficient arms. They went in on the 7th of October with the intent of capturing not only personnel, but local towns and kibbutz and the like. And so they had a very clear plan. Now, the question, of course, is whether or not IRGC, Islamic Republic, Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the Quds Force of Iran's Ayatollah, if they were directly involved, and it would appear, based upon a number of reports they were, that they had intended to use this as arguably a stepping point, a step in the direction of the ultimate destruction of Israel. Keep in mind that Hamas's ideology calls for jihad, martyrdom, and of course the well-established statement that Palestine includes everything from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which basically means the annihilation of all Jews in that area and the reestablishment of what Hamas would argue is the Palestinian state. So there's a lot at stake here. Clearly the Israelis are now making major inroads against Hamas in Gaza, but there's a lot going on more regionally as well as pressure from the United States.
I know you've got different ways of looking at this, and of course, we've seen a lot of American targets being hit. Since this time, they're attacking our bases and places like that. Why would they do that and not just keep this focused on Israel? Why are they wanting to make this and spread it out a little bit?
Well, certainly for the Islamic Republic of Iran, their ambitions since the 1979 revolution that deposed the former Shah has been not just taking over that country, but establishing a caliphate and putting Iranians, the Persians, in charge of the broader global Islamic state world, if you would. And of course, subsequently, they've made it clear as to who they're against. They've labeled the United States as the Great Satan, and of course, the elimination of Israel is a step toward the elimination of the Great Satan. So it's something much broader than just a conflict between a couple of million Palestinians and the Israeli government. It really beckons to something, obviously, I would argue biblically, as to what might the outcome be of this ongoing, war. I would argue, if you go back and to Numbers and Deuteronomy in the Bible, you'll see where Moses and eventually Joshua, when they went into the Promised Land after a delay of 40 years, that the call by Joshua, beginning in the occupation or the destruction of Jericho was to utterly destroy all those people. And why was that? Well, they knew, in fact, that those people would lead the Jewish nation into idolatry. And, of course, they also were identified as people that had giants among them. And it depends upon your interpretation of Genesis 6, verse 4, and certainly Numbers 13:33, and a few other scriptures as to what is the genealogy of those giants. Some people argue it's Nephilim. Others argue that it's an abnormality among the people that were in what arguably today is the old Philistine camp called Gaza. So there's a lot that's in here, and I think a lot does paint a picture, certainly indicators of the prophetic end times and what we might anticipate that being like.
Well, now with you saying that, there's been a lot of speculation and thoughts and talks along the line of this be the beginning of what Ezekiel 37, 38, 39 in that area is talking about happening. We see the players, it's just, all being involved here, and so are we seeing this maybe unfold before us?
Well, as the Lord makes clear, only the Father knows the ultimate end times. What we do see, and I agree with you, is we see unrest with Ukraine and Russia going at one another's throats, and the possibility that will explode into something much larger. We've seen the distancing of the NATO ally Turkey from its former position with much of the West. We've seen, of course, the rise of the Ayatollah and the Persians, and of course in the Far East. And I argue in one of my books, Kings of the East, that the only place in the world where they've ever had an army that compared with what we see in Revelation 9 is in China. During the 50s, you saw a Chinese militia with an active force that was in excess of 100 million. And there's an article that I cite in that particular book that suggested at one point under Mao Zedong in 1957 that the militia and the armed forces of the communist regime approached 200 million. And of course you see that number, which seems to be astronomical, as being part of an end time scenario. I don't know. I just see the instability across the world. I see that our president is going to meet with President Xi of China in mid-November. I see clearly that the Russians are not backing down, even though they are hurting as a result of NATO's supply to the Ukrainians. And I see the buildup in the Mideast and the targeting of American forces throughout that region by the proxies of the Iranian Ayatollah. So there's a lot that's going on, and it certainly spells out great instability. Now, whether or not this is the beginning of the end, I don't know. I just know what it says in the Scriptures.
Yeah. Now, you'd mentioned something, too. You talked about the worldwide effect of these things. We are seeing something I haven't seen. I mean, there was a protest during the Vietnam War. We've seen that. But we've never seen people taking to the streets in big numbers, waving flags for the side that actually is totally wrong in the whole process with the Palestinians. And yet this is becoming more and more of a separating point, being some groups and peoples as much as causing a United States congressman to be censored. Why is this becoming such a greater deal? This is bigger than anything I've seen happening during the Vietnam War.
Yeah, I think it's part and parcel of a number of factors. Certainly, we arguably are going through a cultural revolution, which has many ingredients like what we saw in China during that Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 76, which they targeted the major institutions and, of course, the leadership. And they tried to change the history. They tried to change the culture. And when you do that, your real target is to revamp an entire society. The Chinese did that. Arguably, the French did that in the 18th century. And even the Russians, to a certain degree, used the mechanisms of the institution of the Russia when they took over through the Russian Revolution of 1917. So we are seeing in America that there are what I call proxies, much like you see Hamas as a proxy, Hezbollah, Houthis, and so forth. There are proxies in this country that are using the ongoing revolution that is transforming the public space in the United States, and which started arguably with decades ago, taking over our education establishment, our media, certainly infiltrating our government. And of course, I would argue that what we've seen on the southern border of the United States, a porous, open border, which is inviting to the likes of not only millions of illegals, but also perhaps many, many people that have other than the best intentions against the United States. It only took 19 people on 9/11 to bring this country to its knees. Far more people involved and already in sleeper cells in the United States that are sympathetic to Hamas is doing. Now, at the same time, they planted within our educational establishment a lot of Marxists. If you just do the inventory of who are many of the mainline university college professors and what are their political leanings, many, unfortunately, are very progressive. Some are clearly Marxist. And that's important as well, because they will be sympathetic to the likes of the Islamists in Tehran, if not, indirectly or directly in the payroll. I look at the group Black Lives Matter, which is, of course, well known as having leadership that was educated as Marxists and that are on the dole trying to manipulate the black population during the George Floyd riots of 2020. And I see much the sorts of thing that are manifesting itself in New York and Washington and elsewhere in this country, showing sympathy to the horrendous things that happened in southern Israel on October the 7th. And they could only have done that if they weren't previously planted in the United States, already sympathetic to that cause, encouraged and directed by an ideology that is quite contrary to what the founders of the United States wanted 250 years ago. So there are a host of issues here. I do believe that we're vulnerable, and unfortunately, I think it's by design, because we have a lot of people that are in this country that never should have come here, but were allowed to come here, not only through an open border, but because we've naively allowed some of these ingrates, these horrendous ideologues, and their sympathy for terrorism to come into the midst of this country, and that's very dangerous for our future.
Now, we had talked in the past, a book you'd wrote, Divided We Stand, and before his passing, Thomas Horn put out a book called We Are Legion. In that, you contribute to that on Chapter 5. You have some of your stuff in there, and you do give a founders, a little bit about our history and stuff. And you say there on page 137, you said, "I believe modern America is at a tipping point. Our survival as a nation is at risk. Will this country endure the current level of rank division that threatens our civil liberties at every turn to the very existence of America as a representative republic?" So you see that this is a great danger to our nation.
No, there's no question in my mind. I'm appalled that, we are so focused on issues that are very clear in the Bible about life. look at a recent election in the United States, across many states, where the issue of abortion seemed to dictate party affiliation. And yet, as I've written in a number of books, the Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party of my grandparents, who were loyal Democrats. In fact, it has become the home base for not only progressives who are very much anti-life. They're very much promoting an agenda that would be absolutely appalling if our founders were alive today. They don't respect our civil liberties. They don't respect the sacrifice that we've made over the years, to keep this country as the shining light on the hill. So I do believe that, as I wrote in Tom's book, that we are at a tipping point. It's not just because we have what I characterize as a very bad president because of the open border, the dependence upon government that's promoted, the advancement of transgenderism in our education establishment, a corrupt federal judiciary, or certainly a legal system with Merrick Garland. The list is very long, and I point out a lot of that in my book, Divided We Stand. So I see all of this coming about. Yeah, we're a resilient country, but there's only so much, I would argue, that we can withstand. We've lasted through wars, but this is much different than the things that my grandparents went through in World War II, and that is because the adversary is not only on the outside, but they're also on the inside. We are not unified as a nation, and because we're split, divided deeply along many lines inside this country, and we have a lot of people here that don't love this country as I do, and then the adversaries on the outside, the tension is building to the point, I think, a breaking point, and therefore I talk about a tipping point.
Yeah. Well, folks, stay with us, and we're going to be back with more in just a moment. This is Mark Taylor. If you miss a broadcast of Crosspoint, you can always go to our website at www.kneo.org and click on the programs page. There you can access the current Crosspoint program as well as the last 4 programs that have been aired. Never miss another Crosspoint program again. Go to www.kneo.org today. I'm Mark Taylor, and thanks for joining us today here on Crosspoint. With me, I have Colonel Robert Maginnis. And Colonel, you've written several books. We've talked throughout the years. You've done a lot of stuff, talking on the lines of what we're talking about today, but even the history of our country, how it's affecting our country. If people wanted to find out more about the books you put together and also your ministry, what you do, how would they go about doing that?
Well, I have 10 published books of my own, and then others I've written with, I wrote a number of chapters for some of Tom Horn's books in the past, and others. I do a lot of TV, a lot of radio, Mark. I have a Facebook page. That's how people can follow me. I write articles for, Fox News and American Thinker and other publications. So that's how I stay out there.
Since you're, of course, retired from the military, but are you ever really retired from the military? I mean, when you see things like this happening and you see soldiers being captured and different things, that has to touch you in a different way than it would just regular people out there that maybe doesn't have a military background. And you can see things happening, and you kind of know what's going on behind the scenes, even though you might not exactly be there. But I'm sure you still are involved some way in that area.
Oh, yes, I'm very much involved. In fact, as a contractor, I've been working with the Pentagon for the last 25 years. So I'm very much in the mix, even though I'm not in uniform. I spent a quarter of a century in uniform, and now another quarter of a century working out of the Pentagon on some of the same sorts of issues. So unlike people that retired and left the Washington scene, I'm right in the middle of it, which provides me with insights that probably the vast majority of even those that are retired won't necessarily have.
Yeah. So how do you, when you view what's going on in the Middle East, I mean, we know biblically some of the names relate to the present day nations that are there. And, you know, something that really got my attention was Benjamin Netanyahu saying something here a few weeks ago when this kind of got started. And he was talking about going after Hamas. And he said, you know, he was going to, whatever it takes to get them, he's going to get them. He said, if we have to flatten Damascus. And I just thought, that is a strange thing to say, because I know in the Bible it talks about, you know, if this is the Ezekiel war, it says that Damascus is no more. And I know Damascus is a pretty beat up town already. But, you know, it just, to me, these things, when they say this stuff and I hear this stuff, it just really causes me to, you know, because I believe Israel looks at things today different than our military looks at things.
Yeah, I've worked with the Israeli Defense Force and still do to a certain degree. Netanyahu talks about Damascus for one primary reason right now, and it's not a prophetic reason necessarily. It's a pragmatic one, and that at the airport there and north in Aleppo, another major Syrian city that has been devastated by civil war over the last decade, I think of the IRGC and Quds Force, because it's through flights from Tehran to Damascus and Aleppo that they maintain the supply lines to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And it also explains why, on a regular basis, Israeli F-35s and F-16s make runs across those airports to bomb the residue of what was dumped off by Iranian transports that go in there to sustain the fight, not only by Assad's people there in Damascus, but by the Hezbollah. And keep in mind also, it's just days ago, the United States used 2 F-15s to bomb a arsenal, a supply warehouse full of munitions that were being used by a variety of Iranian proxies in eastern Syria. That was, kind of supply depot for those that were attacking U.S. forces, of which we have about 900 in eastern Syria, guarding a number of facilities, but also our personnel in Iraq. So you have to think more regionally when you're talking about what I call the ghost war that has been going on between Israel and Iran for many, many years. And we don't hear about the strafing runs, routine almost, from Israel against Iranian targets all over the region. But it's a real thing, and it's something we ought to be concerned about and ought to be privy to the fact that Mr. Netanyahu understands that Israel's adversaries are never going to give up, and until either they acquire what they seek, which according to Hamas ideology, of course, is the total extinction of the nation of Israel. And biblically, we know that's not going to happen, but it's not going to be easy to maintain any modicum of peace going forward.
Back in the book there where you made a contribution there and writing in the book Legion, you said, and you mentioned this a while ago about spiritual, you said we must recognize that Satan, his legion of demons, and his human proxies are experts at fostering division and gaining control. So we see this from fleshly side, but really there's a big spiritual side to it that's really fueling this, what's going on over there. It's really a spiritual war, just as much as it is a physical war.
No doubt. What is it? Almost 300 times in the Bible you see mentions of various spirits, many of which are angels doing God's bidding, his messages, and his work with we humans. But you see Satan and his legion, his army of demons, and how they manifest themselves even throughout the New Testament, as Christ confronts them, whether it's, on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, or he confronts Satan, just outside of present-day Jericho, there at the Mount, and he's tempted by Satan, who promises him the world. But Satan is not going to give up until the very end. Now, when we see the manifestations of what's going on across Israel and the broader Middle East, we have to understand that the enemies of the children of Abraham include, the Islamic world, which of course, dates back to 720 or so AD, and many other entities that have really, embraced the father of lies and his agenda. And I would argue that you have a lot of disembodied spirits that have influenced many of these tyrants, whether they be the leadership of Hamas, who happen to be living in sky-rises in Qatar as billionaires, or the Ayatollah in Tehran, or even the royal family in Riyadh. The war, the hatred, all of these seem to be incredibly demonic and very real in today's world. I don't see how else you could describe the very evil that we have routinely seen. Back in 2015, I wrote a book, Never Submit, which was about the genocide of Christians in the Middle East. And, it's so true then, it continues to be true today, that the genocide is not only of Christians, obviously it's of Jews, but, it's being inspired, arguably, from my perspective, by the demonic influence and the direct involvement of Satan and his armies amongst the various people groups that have been led astray by the evil that is so present in that part of the world, as well as here as well.
Yeah. Well, we've had a big slack in people's church attendance and people just drawing away from the church and not spending time with God, reading their Bible, praying, anything like that. We've just seen a decline in that. But now when these things happen, especially the Middle East, people really begin to feel that the world's kind of coming undone, and they start having questions. I've visited with people and said people's come to them and started asking them a bunch of questions that, they don't really even have the answers for. But this maybe is working into God's plan to try to get people's attention and to wake up that something greater is coming. We don't know when, but even people that don't go to church, they do feel that kind of the whole world's just kind of falling apart.
Well, certainly the instability that we see in the world today is hard to deny. You have to be cut off from all information, to believe anything other than that instability is leading to more violence, is leading to something that, biblically, something that is going to ultimately lead about the second coming of Jesus Christ. So I can understand, the problems that they have. I would argue that, because the church in America has abandoned its first love. There was a statement years ago, I think a couple of years ago, maybe 20, by David Wells, who was a professor at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and he wrote in a book, God in the Wasteland. He talks about that for today's Christian, and I'll read one line here, it is one of the defining marks of our time that God is now weightless. Now, what he meant by weightless is not that he's just a spirit, but that he is not having an impact on mankind as he did in the past. And because we've abandoned him to our worries about the world and not as you indicate, Mark, been in His Word, and as a result, we really get, I suppose, unnerved. We see the worst of what is happening, but in reality, He has a plan, and that plan is going to come to fruition whether or not we want to celebrate and glorify Him in our own lives. So you put that in perspective, whether it's the ongoing war with Hamas, which is vicious and certainly not something pleasant to deal with, or the war in Ukraine, or even with Mr. Biden meeting with President Xi and the likelihood of some sort of cataclysmic situation with regard to Taiwan, or more broadly between these two nuclear nations, the United States and China, which is something that they talked about a year ago, and I'm likely they'll talk about in their new meeting. All of these issues are unnerving to a world, and especially the United States, in the post-pandemic situation that we find today with high inflation, with government corruption, and the like. So when I talk about "in divided we stand," it's true. We are incredibly divided today, and I would argue in part because we've abandoned our first love as a Christian nation that was founded 250 years ago, because we were founded on Christian principles, and all you have to do is read the Declaration of Independence from the monarchy of Great Britain and recognize that our founders had a love for God, and they put Him first, and yet we no longer see that in our country.
Well, folks, interesting conversation we got going on today with Colonel Robert Maginnis. Stay with us. We're going to have more in just a moment.
Sometimes we can get stressed about life.
You might be having a bad day or something, then it just reminds you, God's good. God's watching out for me. No matter what situation you're in, you can turn on the radio and just be reminded of it anytime.
Helping keep your eyes focused on Him. This is 91.7 The Word.
Welcome back. This is Cross Point. I'm talking to Colonel Robert Maginnis today. Now, Colonel Maginnis, again, people can come to your Facebook page, or do you have a website? But if people want to find out more about your books and try to, find out more about what you do and how things go there with your ministry, what do they do?
Well, they can go to, of course, Amazon or Barnes & Nobles and all sorts of places have my books marked. Google my name. There are hundreds of programs and television programs, thousands of radio programs. So I've been doing this for decades. So I've been around. They can find me.
I want to quote again out of the book there that Tom had wrote, but where you had contributed to there in chapter 5. And you say an overwhelming Americans, 83%, describe the current state of our economy as poor, best, not good. 1/3, about 35%, are dissatisfied with the financial situation. And only about a quarter of them believe that we have any chance to improve the standard of our living. And then down below there on the page, you said America's current polarization is marked by growing subsets of the population that embrace radically dissimilar attitudes, not just in the political parties, but in ideologies, government, and policies. Colonel, how do people, maybe in the Middle East or worldwide, how do they view America right now?
Well, they see that we're torn apart. I would argue that, the people in downtown Tehran are watching the pro-Palestinian attacks in this country, and especially the anti-Semitism, and they're saying, "Oh, we've got America where we want them." They're imploding upon themselves because they're going against what is in their key ally, Israel's best interest. And in fact, I wrote an op-ed on that very issue, arguing that that these proxies, that whether they're official proxies or just ideological proxies that are pumping up this pro-Palestinian mindset in the United States today, are serving the purposes of the Ayatollah in Tehran, with the overall objective of separating the United States, what they call the Great Satan, from the Little Satan, which is Israel. And if they can separate us, then what they'll do is that it'll be easier for them to utterly destroy Israel. Keep in mind, the United States, since the agreement between Arafat, Golda Meir, and Sadat. We have been giving them billions, the Israelis as well as the Egyptians, billions of dollars in arms every year. And so their ability to defend themselves has been greatly tethered to the United States. And, of course, recently, since October the 7th, many plane loads and surface ships have delivered other arms and other supplies to the Israelis to sustain operations. Arguably, they couldn't do that without our direct involvement. And so Iran would like nothing better than to have us distance ourselves from Israel to, stop sending arms, stop sending support. And I think that's, to a certain degree, what the agenda of what's happening on our streets and in the international forum against the Jewish population, not only in Israel, but even in this country. And so you have that. And, of course, you have the arguments that these ongoing wars that we're supporting through Israel or Ukraine or others, that we're paying a hefty price, and which is true. We're pumping tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars into these wars. And people are saying, well, what are we getting out of it, given that we have high inflation, the cost of gas and groceries is going through the roof, and yet our government seems to not understand that printing more money on top of what they've already overspent is going to be in our best interest. So these are all issues of grave concern for most Americans, and the instability is unnerving, and it's hard to understand how we can pull out of this short of God's direct intervention.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that's real concerning is we keep giving ammunitions and weapons to these, Ukraine or Israel as well, which would be better for Israel, but we've got to be running out of supplies or running our supplies low down by doing these kind of things, and I keep thinking, scratching my head, thinking that Russia's got their hand in this Israeli deal too somewhere, because I know they have a huge naval port there, I believe, in Syria.
They have a naval port that they've had for years. They have Air Force bases in Syria. They have a lot of forces there. They have the Wagner Group as mercenaries. And of course, we've killed hundreds of them over the years. And so, yes, Russia is very, very involved indirectly in the region. And there are a lot of Russian Jews in Israel today. I've met a number of them in my trips over there. So, yes, that's the reality that we face in an unstable area. Now, as far as the gifting of our arms, what most Americans don't understand is that today is not like it was back in 1938 when FDR basically used federal law to direct the likes of Ford and Chevrolet to revamp their factories to make tanks and airplanes and the like. We don't do that today. We don't have the same authority. And so the arsenal, the weapons, the ammunition that we have is limited in our ability. We, up until recently, were only producing enough to sustain training for the United States forces. And so we are draining our arsenals of artillery and javelins and stingers and HIMARS and Patriot missiles and the like. And we're sending them to places like Israel or Iraq or Ukraine. And it takes, in some cases, years to stand up a production facility. And these sophisticated weapons can take months, if not years, through a series of contractors to build those systems. And so, it's not been widely reported and much less understood by the majority of the American people that this administration is certainly putting us in jeopardy to a certain degree by emptying our arsenals should we be attacked or threatened, which could happen at any time by the likes of the Russians, the Chinese, and even the North Koreans or the Iranians or their surrogates.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I've heard that they found North Korean weapons involved with this situation over there, though they found evidence. Some of them have come from North Korea as well. So this is there's quite a mess we've got out there. This surely, though, is playing all into God's plan. Man's plan gets all flustered and messed up, but God's plan has never changed, and He's right on time with what He's doing, even though we're seeing this with a different eye.
Absolutely. We began the interview. I don't know, and nobody knows except the Father, the Creator, when He's going to pull the plug. When He's going, okay, enough's enough. I don't know, but we've been told, Matthew 24 and elsewhere, that there are indicators. And so we look out there and we see wars and rumors of wars. We see pestilence. We see, starvation, one thing or another. And it certainly, from this perspective, seems to be a pretty tough time. But there have been other times in the hundreds of years that we've been recording these types of things. And I know that it's easy to get discouraged, but somehow, certainly the body of Christ needs to respond as Christ would, and that is to, work with those that are hurting and encourage them to make decisions for their own salvation, because there is a time coming, whether they die before the return of Christ, but there is a time coming, and that all of us have to be accountable for that which we've done or not done.
We know there's generals and all these different people that's in charge of moving things around in the area of warfare, but really the bottom line is Satan's behind all of this. Anything that's got destruction to do with it, murder and killing and raping and all that, we know it has to be demonic forces that are involved as well. So we have to fight this battle not just with our hands, but we've got to fight it with two fronts, with our knees probably even more so than other. So what would you tell Christians today? How should they handle what they're seeing in the Middle East?
Well, they need to be in prayer, on their knees. They need to be in their Word. God's Word has all the answers. Now, whether or not you understand those answers may have to do with your faith and your understanding of the Scripture, because it's a love letter written to Christians, and if you don't understand it, you probably need to think about your salvation status. And so, yes, this is a war. Satan is real, but God has angels too, and those angels are His messengers to us in these times of great strife and trouble. So we need to understand that we win in the end. Revelation's very clear, but getting there, and when we get there as a human race, I don't know. It's going to happen, but it may not be in my lifetime or your lifetime or anyone listening's lifetime, but it's going to happen. God's, faithful to His Word, and so understand what His Word says, and then be in prayer, and His Holy Spirit will lead you to discernment as to what role you ought to play in going forward.
Yeah. So what can the church be doing? I mean, I've heard that there's some churches that still aren't even really talking about what's going on with Israel. Should a church be pointing this out now? Is this something that should be pointed out by pastors in their churches?
I don't see how they can ignore it. These are tenuous times. If you're feeling it economically, you're feeling it through the influencers outside of your home, in the schools and your papers, on the television, in the community. There are indicators all around us as to the direction, which is not comforting, as to where this world seems to be going. So, as I said earlier, God isn't weightless. God, has a plan. His Word must mean something to us, must direct our lives if we're believers, and we should not be over-focused on, what the Satan and his demonic armies are doing, but rather what God has in mind. That doesn't mean we're not going to suffer. It just means we know what the end of the story is.
Yeah, no doubt about that. One other thing, why was the attack that we seen such a violent attack? This was kind of not normal when what happened, the way they did things, unless that's the way they look at normal, I guess. But, it was pretty gruesome of what we've seen of the pictures and the things we've heard that's coming out of that area. Why such depths of that?
Well, we've seen this in the past. We saw this with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Just the despicable, the horrendous treatment. Yes, we saw in southern Israel the beheading of children, the raping of women, the desecration of so much. But this is not really new in the history of mankind. We've seen it many, many times. We certainly saw it during World War II. We've seen it through the history of mankind in ways that are just appalling. It makes your stomach turn. But we shouldn't be surprised. That is Satan. That's the demonic armies out there. They are seeding the hatred, the inhumane treatment, and we see it in places like Western China in their treatment of Uyghurs. They rob their body parts to kill them, to sell. They rape their women. They torture them in terrible situations, and we see it even in our own country with some of the treatment that we've seen on the sidelines. Unfortunately, there's much in the darkness, even in our own country, that is really just terribly appalling as to the inhumanity of man to his fellow man. So I'm not surprised. It's terrible, but it's a reality of what we face.
Well, we could continue on, and, you kind of just want to say, Lord, come quickly when these things keep companion. But, again, tell people how they can just Google your name, and that'll bring up this kind of information and about your books and all that.
Mark, my last name is Maginnis. My Irish forefathers changed their name when they came to this country, so they anglicized it a bit. So you look up my name, and I've got a bunch of books out there, 10 published. Got another one coming in the spring of this coming year. And then, of course, I wrote chapters for Tom Horn and others over the years. I've got a lot of articles by Fox News and other outlets, and certainly a lot of TV out there if you really want to look at me.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today here on Crosspoint.
Okay, Mark. Thank you for having me.
All right, folks. Some good information there today Colonel Maginnis gave us. It's so good when you have a person that understands military, understands the Middle East, like what's going on now, but always understanding it from a Christian perspective. Now, why is that? Because he knows what the Bible says, the very book I hold in my hand right now. And because of the Bible, anyone can learn what leads them down the road of life to eternal life. It's a book that's never outdated. The Bible will never be outdated. And it accurately will direct your life every day if you'll follow it, because it's the most important words you're ever going to read, and you certainly need to be following. Be sure to join us again next time as we again discuss issues that are having an effect on the church. Have a great week and allow God to use you for His purposes so that greater things can be done. Make your life count in God's plans for eternity. I'm Mark Taylor.
Crosspoint is a program produced in Studio 101 at KNEO Radio. Not all of the views on Crosspoint reflect those of the management or staff of KNEO. You may contact the Crosspoint program at 10827 Highway 86 East, Neosho, Missouri 64850, or by email crosspoint@kneo.org. You can hear Crosspoint 4 times a week, Saturday morning at 1, Saturday afternoon at 2, Saturday evening at 9, and Sunday evening at 7. You can also listen anytime online at kneo.org.
Are you walking in everything God has for you? Hi, I'm Pastor Gary Culp, and I'd like to invite you to check out the Exceedingly Abundant Ministries podcast, available from the Sky High Podcast Network. This 30-minute weekly Bible study will give you time to grow spiritually and get to know God and His Word on a deeper level. God has more in store for you than you ever realized. Listen to Exceedingly Abundant Ministries today and learn about how God can do more with your life than you ever imagined.
Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri is proud to be sponsoring this portion of broadcasting on KNEO. Owned by Judy and Danny Harper, Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri specializes in French Bulldogs. For more information, the phone number is 417-628-3083.